Good afternoon, Patriots, and welcome to the 80th audio chat on the Q News Patriot Rumble channel series. I am the Q News Patriot, coming to you with scientist and Patriot researcher, Dr. Dan Cohen. My name is SG Anon. One of the brightest points of the post-COVID landscape in the world is the emergence of highly skilled, disciplined professionals seeking to influence their professions and to wage that culture war in reverse. We've seen the agencies, the institutions, the unelected bureaucratic arm of the government of the United States sort of pounding good practitioners and good professionals into submission or driving them out of the industries entirely. And thank goodness for people like Dr. Cohen that have stuck it out and who are willing to bring things that they've been developing and researching to the fore for a very long time, for such a time as this. It's truly a pleasure to have him on. Dr. Cohen, thank you for joining.
Well, thank you for having me.
You know, when we got connected initially, or rather, I should say, the email threads that got us connected initially, I was absolutely fascinated by the background, by the technology and the work that you all have been delving into, and how it's focused at the brain and helping to heal both the body and I think in some respects even the mind through proper restorative sleep and a balance of the neurological condition within the body that we've been so out of balance with respect to our homeostatic state for a very long time. I'd like to get into that here in a minute, but since you're meeting the audience for the first time, do you care to give us a summary of your background, sir?
Sure. I grew up in the Philadelphia area, and I went off to Penn State for college, and then I went to medical school in Philadelphia, Temple Medical School. And I was always interested in the brain and mind. And I had a difficult time deciding, do I want to become a neurologist or a psychiatrist? And the truth of the matter was, I wanted to be grounded in the physical. So I decided I would become a neurologist, and I did. I came out to Minnesota because at the time it was the largest program in the world. And I went through the program, became a board certified neurologist. And I thought about my future at that point, and I said, do I want to practice this? And back then it was 1981, 82. Neurology couldn't offer that much in the form of therapy. And I decided I would rather go into research and actually develop technology. So in 1982, a friend of mine and I started a company called CNS, for central nervous system, Inc. And in essence, we built the first automated brainwave monitor to be used during surgery, particularly during high-risk surgeries. So we did that. We took it out into the market. We had to get FDA clearance for it. And then we took the same hardware. And remember, back in 1982, you were dealing with the early PCs. So you had like the IBM PC with an 8088 chip in it. So it was pretty primitive. But we took that hardware that we had developed for the brainwave monitor and we took it into sleep labs. And at the time, there were only 300 sleep labs in the world. And so we literally were the people that automated sleep labs, because at the time, you'd do a recording at night, you'd have half a mile of paper, a technician would take 4 to 6 hours to analyze it, and ultimately we could do it in a minute. And so by the time we left that field 10 years later, the number of sleep labs had grown from 300 to 3,000, most of which were using our technology. Yeah. And so, and then I decided to get into some consumer products as well. One day, this guy walked in with what my board of directors called a nose Band-Aid, and I couldn't resist licensing it, even without their permission. And that became the Breathe-Rite nasal strip. And yeah, well, it wasn't so funny when they came into my office 2 days later and said, "What the hell do you think you're doing?" And they said, if you think this is such a good idea, replace yourself in the sleep division and you take this out to market. So I said, all right, I don't know anything about consumer products, but I'll try to get it done. And I was successful. Procter & Gamble wanted to buy it early on, and they said, we could never launch it because at the time, this was pre-internet. They basically said, look, we're the world's experts at launching consumer products, and it costs us $50 million to do it. And you're a public company, so we know you only have 10 million in the bank, so you'll never be able to do it. Let us take it over. We'll cut you a good deal, so on and so forth. And I said, well, you know what? We got a plan. I said, we'll try it. And if it doesn't work, I'll be back to you. And so we parted on good terms. And then after we launched it using football players, and after having seeded the media, with press kits, they called us up from P&G and they said, you just rewrote the textbook on how to launch a consumer product. And so it was nice of them to do that. And then, after we sold CNS Inc., I wanted to get back to something that really bothered me that I learned in medical school. And that was stress. Chronic stress either causes or worsens between 75 to 90% of all medical problems. So I would ask my professors, well, why aren't we treating chronic stress as a primary pathology? Why aren't we working harder to solve that issue? And they actually had good answers. They said, look, it's part of the brain. It's a primitive part of the brain that's buried deep in the middle. We really can't get at it directly, so we can't stimulate it in any other way. It's not the kind of thing that we could use pharmacology on effectively, because the same neural receptors that were in that part of the brain, as the brain evolved, they were spread out throughout the rest of the brain. So the side effects would be enormous. So they said, we can't use drugs. We can't stimulate it with electrodes in any way. And so we're left with behavioral techniques like breathing exercises, relaxation exercises, meditation. And the bottom line is, people that are stressed don't have the time to learn those techniques to be effective enough to fix the problem. So there was really no good treatment for it. And so, my partner and I, we had done very well with the sale of CNS, and we devoted $10 million to research chronic stress. And could we figure out a way to solve it safely and non-invasively? And it took us really 15 years to make our first discovery. So it was a lot of effort. And since then, we've made a number of other discoveries, but with our technology, we've been able to do that really without user involvement, and it's safe, it's non-invasive, and it works. So that's kind of brings us up to date.
Absolutely powerful. So, if I'm correct to understand, you and your partner essentially self-funded the research needed to inform the development of the technology that has been described to me as Soltec, Soltec. If I'm not mistaken, Doctor, that sort of segues the conversation in a really nice way, because the entirety of I think the issue now worldwide is that there is so much chronic stress, especially in the Western world. There is such a cascading effect of increasingly earlier diagnoses of diseases. And I think a lot of that we can trace back to trauma and stress. And I think trauma does cause stress. I'm not a medical practitioner, but just from my own personal experiences, I've been pretty stressed when I've been traumatized. And so, how does that, I guess my question is, how does that take us towards the sleep discussion? As we move through life, we spend a third of our life in bed. We know that our brains need a rest period periodically. We can go a pretty significant period of time without sleep, but eventually we have to have that sleep. So where do the stress discussions and the sleep discussions merge?
That's a great question. And essentially, when you think about stress, you have to go back to the autonomic nervous system. It's a primitive part of the nervous system that exists in pretty much all animals. And this is located in what's called the brain stem. So the spinal cord, as it comes up into the head, it turns into the brain stem. And the center, or the controlling aspect of the brain stem, is it's in that area. It's in the area that we call the pons and the midbrain. And this is the brain of the autonomic nervous system. And there's two divisions. I think many people in your audience will have heard of the phrase fight or flight, which is known as
Indeed.
what the sympathetic division does. And the parasympathetic division is what is known as rest and digest. So it's basically relax. And so the question was, how do you stimulate that area of the brain? And I won't get into the details of it. I can if you want, but essentially, that area, the parasympathetic division of the autonomic nervous system, is the same area that controls the different stages of sleep. That's the pacemaker of the different sleep stages. And so when we realized we could stimulate that area effectively, and we did it with specific magnetic frequencies that, you know, we were able to document these nicely from research that had been done in the 80s and 90s by a company called HeartMath, when they looked at heart rate variability, and they found that they could define the frequencies of the autonomic nervous system that way. And these frequencies are lower than brainwave frequencies. They're in the range of 0.003 to 0.4 cycles per second. So it's very low. And it makes sense, because as the brain evolved, as more and more functions and layers were added to it, they operate at higher frequencies. And so we had to determine, well, what were the frequencies associated with deep sleep, or what's called delta sleep? What were the frequencies associated with dream sleep and with light sleep? And then as we learned this through experimentation, we realized we could produce these. And then the next step was, well, let's develop a wearable that can measure these things and know when the person is moving into these different stages of sleep. And then tell the generator, the magnetic generator that sits on the floor under the bed, okay, put out these frequencies, because the person's moving into these, and we want to support and enhance that stage of sleep. So we call that real-time sleep stage enhancement. And so we got that to work, and then all of a sudden we started to realize, hey, you know what, we could really help a person sleep. But, you know, as you may know, SG, as we age, we lose deep sleep. Even by the time we reach our mid to late 40s, we've already lost 60 to 70% of our deep sleep. And it's a natural occurrence. Yeah, it's really bad, because, you know, it sort of peaks, you know, in your late teens, and then it starts to decline. And if you looked at the correlation, as you lose deep sleep, the incidence and the prevalence of illnesses increases, because deep sleep is so important to the prevention or cure of medical illnesses. And so, and the reason for that is that during deep sleep, growth hormone is released, so that repairs and rejuvenates cells. It even repairs DNA during deep sleep. So this is all a natural phenomenon. It boosts the immune system. It regulates your endocrine system. So it's vital in terms of resetting the metrics, the parameters that the body needs to regulate itself. And delta sleep is that it's the most important stage of sleep. And that's been proven during sleep deprivation studies, because when you allow somebody to go back to sleep, the stage of sleep that rebounds the most is deep sleep, delta sleep.
Fascinating. So there is a measurable and sort of a kinetic effect that comes off of the activity of the brain under stress, the activity of the brain when activated into that sympathetic, I think is what you said, nervous system a moment ago, and the quality of sleep and the actual brainwave states that are achievable for that person. Is that a correct summary of that segment?
Yeah, I mean, it's the parasympathetic division that regulates these different stages, and they're reflected, you know, when you move into deep sleep, delta sleep was named because of the brain waves that are emanated. And so we, you know, the common mistake is to think that our big cerebral hemispheres that fill up our, you know, cranial vault, to think that, okay, that produces sleep. Well, no, it's a reflection of sleep. Sleep is produced deep, you know, way down in the primitive brain. I mean, reptiles sleep, okay? And they don't have a cerebral hemisphere, okay? So what happens is this deep sleep occurs and it can be regulated, but as you get older and you lose it, you're really losing the circuitry that's involved in creating and disseminating the effects of deep sleep throughout the brain, and then therefore throughout the rest of the body. And so we never thought when we started this project, I mean, remember, we were interested in solving stress. We never thought that that we could actually do something with sleep other than sort of support sleep, not enhance it. And what surprised us was that as we gave these frequencies to people that had lost delta sleep, over time, delta sleep started to be restored. And that was not an overnight process, because you've probably heard of the term neuroplasticity.
Indeed, is that for the audience out there, that is the abilities, the brain's ability to respond to changing stimuli. Is that correct?
That is absolutely correct. And that can be internal stimuli as well. So for instance, if you all of a sudden take up the practice of meditation, a month or two later, if you're had brain scans or they've looked at your EEG, it would be different because your circuitry would develop. The brain's much more dynamic than was thought, 40 years ago. And this has been illustrated study after study. This is science fact. And so we didn't realize, though, that by giving this kind of stimulation, we could actually restore deep sleep. I mean, 5 years ago, I'm 72 now. 5 years ago, my delta sleep was extremely low. I might have had 20 minutes a night. And it really impacted me, because when you lose deep sleep, you also lose the ability to sleep for, a long period of time. And so my sleep had deteriorated to the point where I only slept 3 to 4 hours a night. And that wasn't enough. I mean, I had to take naps, 3, 4 cups of coffee a day, to basically function. And after using this, I have the sleep now, or delta sleep, of a 25-year-old. Yeah, I average an hour and a half of deep sleep a night. So it does come back, which is really nice.
Well, that leads me directly into my next question, Doctor, which is the Z-Gen magnetic system itself. This is as I understand, this is sort of the engine that drives the technology itself. It's centered around magnetic frequency adjustment and utilizing magnetic frequencies to, I believe you said a moment ago, it helps support the brain's natural rhythmic activities, natural functions. Can you help the audience understand specifically how the technology works with respect to sleep?
Yeah. Essentially, and you characterized it very nicely. The generator, we call it Z-Gen, has two magnets in two aluminum tubes. And Z-Track, which is the wearable, instructs the generator what frequencies to rotate the magnets. And we've learned that the range of frequencies for delta sleep in a very, very normal person. Okay, and remember, there's very few normal people out there. Okay, but those frequencies typically are in the range of 0.24, 0.25 cycles per second. So we're talking about a really narrow range of frequencies. And so we thought that, okay, if we just ran the generator at those frequencies, we would produce deep sleep in people. And we certainly did in some, but not everybody. And I was really perplexed, because this part of the nervous system is, it has to be sort of the same in all of us, because it controls all of our bodily functions. And when I saw that there were some people that didn't respond at all to these frequencies, I put my white coat back on and I started to interview them like a doctor. And I realized that with the traumas of life, particularly childhood trauma, people ended up functioning using their autonomic nervous system at lower frequencies, closer to the frequencies of the sympathetic division, fight or flight. They were really stressed. And as I interviewed some of the people that responded the least at the normal frequencies, I realized they were all hypervigilant. They were like scanning the environment for potential danger. And these people all had PTSD. So the only way they felt comfortable was when they felt like they were in control of the system and they could see or hear that there was no danger. Because some of these people had been severely traumatized as very, very young children, and traumatized physically and emotionally. So it's very sad. And so we realized we had to adjust for their use of the autonomic nervous system. And once we gave them frequencies that were lower, more towards the sympathetic division, then they responded. And that caused us to have to reconfigure our system and develop a calibration routine to see what frequencies does each person need in order to have improved sleep. And so we call that res F, or what is that person's resonant frequency? And that occurs during the first 5 nights of use. It determines what's the right frequency for the individual. And then we have auto res F, because thereafter, just in case there are changes during life, it'll constantly monitor and make appropriate changes as needed.
Absolutely powerful. So the system itself is sort of a guide in many respects for meeting people where they're at. The pastor's pulpit would say that we are meeting people where they're at so that we can bring them to a higher level of functioning, one that's much more restorative and much more balanced. Is that correct?
Absolutely, that is absolutely true. And then we still, so most of the people were doing very well at that point, but there was still a group of people that needed um, sort of like a magnetic sleeping pill. It's the best way I can describe it. Um, as we get older, there's more of a likelihood to wake up in the middle of the night and then have a difficult time getting back to sleep. And we found that we had to give those people, when that occurred, a different stimulus that essentially made the cerebral cortex, it sort of put that to sleep so that people stop thinking in the middle of the night. And so, which is what sleeping pills do. Sleeping pills are sedatives. They don't they don't affect the part of the brainstem that um, that is the pacemaker of sleep, that regulates the different stages of sleep. They don't produce normal sleep, they produce sedation. Okay. And so, but what we realized is we had to do something that was somewhat comparable. It's not exactly the same thing, but we would give a little dose of these low brainwave frequencies, which helped dull the conscious state enough where it was easier to fall back to sleep.
That is absolutely incredible, Dr. Cohen. I have to admit, as we look at processing what has occurred just in the world over the last 4 to 5 years, not even to mention, personal and individual adversity that comes as a natural course of life, restorative sleep seems to be, or seems like it would have to be one of the cornerstones of the overall discussion. We have extreme levels, I think, of betrayal that we have to heal across multiple levels of society. We have a lot of different individual opinions about various recorded events that have occurred over the last 4 to 5 years. The public discussion, we have to be, I think, fortitudinal enough to have that with one another. So being properly rested, being properly balanced and centered in as low of a unnecessary stress state as we can be. I mean, that seems like it would be essential to that broader discourse. Am I correct in saying that?
Oh, absolutely, because there's a tremendous relationship between sleep and stress. If first of all, if you've got stress, you're not going to sleep as well. You might have trouble falling asleep because you're worried about certain things, so you're going to think about them when you go to bed. If you wake up in the middle of the night, you might start thinking about them again. So there's a big problem with stress causing poor sleep. But the other happens in reverse, and that is if you have poor sleep, you're more prone to develop stress. So it's a sort of a vicious cycle and a downward spiral. If you start with one, you end up typically developing the other.
So in light of that, Dr. Cohen, if I may ask, what is the plan to bring the technology itself to the broader market? And my audience out there is going to be pretty big fans of anything that's not FDA approved for a number of different reasons, but certainly that from what I understand, you all also have studies and engagement with that arena, trying to get that approval for broader rollout, despite some of the corruption and the contraption that's happening in the U.S. government. But if I may be so bold, what is the overarching plan and the vision for bringing this product to market for the average person?
Well, it's an interesting plan. When you're a small company, and we are a small company, we funded the beginning of it. Since then, we've only raised about $13 million. So, which is kind of amazing to have this level of technology with only $23 million spent. You see these other companies that are spending hundreds of millions of dollars, for, something simple. And this is much more complicated. And so what I tend to do when I look at what you're talking about, what's the best way to get this out to the world? I look for leverage points in other companies. In other words, what other company can help us do this and benefit them as well? Because, in truth, you'd have to look at us and say, are we the right company to take this product to the world, given the fact that we do not have a global footprint and the world needs this product in a big way? Everybody can use this. Everybody can sleep better. Everybody's got some level of stress. So this would be ideal to be in the hands of a large company with a global footprint that can do it. And so as we've studied the market, it's apparent that, we have our own wearable, but there are lots of companies and lots of big companies that have wearables. What if we gave them the ability to have wearable run our generator? Because really that's the unique part of the technology that we bring to the table. That's our sort of star. And when you look at all the wearable companies out there, they don't have any therapeutics associated with them. They're simply, a monitoring. And so it was funny when, we're located in the Twin Cities in Minneapolis, and the headquarters of Best Buy is located here as well. We're kind of right down the street. And so I know the folks over there. So I went to meet with them a couple of years ago, before we were ready to launch the product. And one of their senior executives barged into the room, and he poked his finger right in my face, and he says, "I don't give a crap about your wearable. I want that generator." He says, "I've been wearing this wearable, and all it does is make me feel bad about my sleep. You know where that wearable is now? It's sitting on the floor in the corner of my office because it does me no good." And so it's evident to these retailers that, wait a minute, we need some therapeutic associated with these things. However, none of these large companies has developed any therapy that goes along with their wearable. We have this wearable that has a closed feedback loop, but we could supply these wearable companies with a little encrypted module in firmware that these people can insert in their firmware and run our generator. So we've started to reach out to some of these companies, and we're in early discussions. But it's interesting because we'll be using Best Buy as a retailer starting in Q1 of next year, probably in January. And Best Buy's offered to reach out to all these companies because they carry them, and they love to bundle our generator with those companies' wearables. So we'll see what develops. But I have a strong suspicion that there will be a linkage there because, I think it benefits everybody.
As I'm listening to you describe the innovativeness of this particular venture and the dedication and honestly the passion that I can hear as well that's gone into this particular technology, I have to say I'm very impressed. This is the epitome in many ways of the limitless nature of the entrepreneurial spirit and the desire to do right by one's fellow man. And that being said, Dr. Cohen, I just have to ask, board certified neurologist, heavily involved in research, one of the leading experts, I would imagine, certainly in North America on these topics, developer of multiple technologies. Now, you're intimately acquainted with the human being from an anatomical and physiological basis point. This audience out there, the Q News Patriot audience, is very curious, I think, in many regards about the things about the human being that we were never taught in school, specifically things like the power of the brain, the unused components of our minds, things of that nature. What in a and even if having to be framed in a spiritual sense, but what would you describe as being most impressive or one of the major takeaways of your journey through life as it pertains to the human being?
Well, I mean, you've touched on something that's sort of near and dear to me. The reason I decided to become a physician and to specialize in either neurology or psychiatry was when I was 15 years old. My mother gave me this book, Autobiography of a Yogi by Paramahansa Yogananda. And I read that book and I was sort of floored. I said, boy, can these people actually do this? And, and as I learned more and more during medical school and during my residency, I said, there's a lot going on here that medical science doesn't like to discuss. And so I would bring some of these up, and my professors would haul me into their office and say, "We don't discuss that in the hall room, in the hallway. We can have these discussions privately." And and so when you talk about the mind and consciousness, it's really quite fascinating, because what I would say is that the mind that is generated by the brain, from the brain itself, equates to the egoic mind. And really the egoic mind is, our beliefs, our attitudes, our memories, the processes we've learned. And these are all things that are stored in the brain. And it develops some level of one's personality. And then, when you look at our Western cultures, where the general belief is life equals chemistry, and life is organic only, there's a huge difference in Eastern cultures. And there you have people that speak about energy. And, the Chinese call it qi, the Japanese call it ki, in Ayurvedic medicine, it's prana, but it's really an energetic system. And so, as I read more and more about these things, I was curious as to how is there an interaction between those energetic forces and the nervous system itself, so that these things can come into play. And at the same time I was doing that, it was interesting because NIH, our National Institute of Health, was sort of under pressure to make a decision. Are they going to acknowledge these kinds of phenomena that, were well known in the East? And so they developed the Office of Alternative Medicine. And it was really to help define the Western viewpoint of these energies, whatever they are. And what happened as a result of that, and that was formed in 1991, by 1993, the committee that was formed around the Office of Alternative Medicine was, or had defined what they called the biofield. And they literally compared it to the Eastern terms of qi, ki, prana. So they said, yes, there is something there. So they acknowledged it, but medicine as a practice never really changed. We developed functional medicine, and we developed there's some people that practice energetic medicine. But I have to tell you that both here and even, in Eastern societies, our level of understanding of these things is so rudimentary that we haven't made a lot of progress. Now, we've done some research in that arena, and we think we understand it pretty well. And, we even think our technology plays a role in that. But it's going to take us a little bit more time, I think, to sort of bring that to the forefront where we can speak about it more scientifically and show cause and effect.
And may we live to see that fantastic and wonderful day. Dr. Cohen, for
I
Patriots.
think we will.
Oh, I think we will as well, sir. For Patriots out there, is the best way to reach out through the website at soltechhealth.com.
Yeah, there's at the top, you'll see a support button. And if you go there and fill out a form and just say, you want me to respond, I certainly will take responses. It's the best way to get in touch with me. I could give you my email if that helps more directly. Would you like me to do that, SG?
Please.
Yeah, it's D Cohen, so DCOHEN at Soltech Health, SOLTEC, and then health, HEALTH, all one word, soltechhealth.com.
Dr. Cohen, it has been a true pleasure and one of the more interesting and in-depth conversations that we've ever had here on this show. I want to thank you personally for taking the time out. I know you're a remarkably busy man. For the audience out there, I hope you very much enjoyed our conversation today. I'll be back with each of you on the Q News Patriot channel very soon. God bless everyone. Stay safe.